Hi folks, it's Irisanya Moon, and I'm here to share with you my 10th book that came out today. It is Hestia, Goddess of Hearth, Home, and Community. This is my 10th book, I think, with Moon Books, and it's part of the Pagan Portals series. And I'm really excited to get to share some bits with you and to maybe invite you into Hestia's magic. Please feel free to comment and interact as you can. I will do my best to answer you. Talk a little bit about myself for a second because not everybody might know who I am. And if you're watching this recording later, thanks so much for your time. I'm Irisanya Moon. My pronouns are she and they. I'm currently living on the land of the Coast Miwok, Southern Pomo, and Wapo peoples, which is now known as Santa Rosa, California in the United States. I am an author, a witch, a priestess, a poet, an international teacher, and an initiate in the reclaiming tradition. And I tend to write books on various Greek deities, although there is one Norse in there, and mostly to bring forward ideas or energies that I think might be helpful in the current culture. And it's always interesting because I tend to write these books a year before anybody else sees them, and they're shockingly helpful. And I see Lola. Hi, Lola. So good to see you. So what I'm going to do in this hour that we have together-ish, I'm going to sort of go through the book, go through it a little bit chapter by chapter. We're going to look at it a little bit, and then I'm going to leave some time at the end if anybody has questions or comments. You can definitely do it as we're going along, but I might miss it, and I've seen that happen in past lives. So just to have some grace. All right, so Hestia. Hi, Anne. So I'll just start right from the top, and I'll talk about what the overall sort of impression, energy is that I wanted to bring with this book. In a culture that often prioritizes and celebrates rugged individualism and separateness, Hestia welcomes us home. Her magic invites togetherness and shared resources by cultivating spaces of belonging and community. May Hestia call us back to our homes to celebrate families of all shapes, sizes, and forms, creating sustainable structures for ongoing collaboration and nourishment. May that be so. So one thing I wanted to sort of say that is in the book, but I get to be a little bit more detailed about it when I talk live about it, is that this book actually came out of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who lives in Australia. And we were talking one morning after they had so lovingly made me breakfast, and we were talking about what felt important to share in community at the time, and talking about like how to build sustainable communities, how to get through conflict, all of the stuff that is very normal and human. And I was sort of thinking about what my next book proposal might be, and we both sort of landed on Hestia. So I want to give Jera a big thank you for inspiring this work. And I would also give a big thanks to my mentor, Copper Persephone, who died in 2020, because she embodied Hestia, even though she would say that her energy was more Freya. So this book has 8 chapters in it, 8 main chapters, and it goes in some of the same way as other books I've written, so very much sort of an intro and talking about how to encounter a deity through trance, through a meditative practice, and then sort of moving through different areas of information and hopefully inspiration. So I love reading texts about the gods, so let's do that. So this comes from the Homeric hymns. Hestia and the high dwellings of all, both deathless gods and men who walk on earth, you have gained an everlasting abode and highest honor. Glorious is your portion and your right. For without you mortals hold no banquet, where one does not duly pour sweet wine in offering to Hestia, both first and last. That's something we should say right from the start. So many rituals, when practiced in Greek tradition or Greek mythology, tradition, Hellenistic, whatever you want to call it, a lot of folks will say modernized Greek practices, but from what I can tell from my research is that Hestia was honored before all, at the beginning of rituals, before meetings and gatherings. You would give an offering, the hearth would be lit, and it was very important to keep that hearth lit throughout not only the meeting or the gathering, but to keep it lit in your home, but we'll get to that. So chapter 1 is encountering Hestia. And, you know, for me in all my books, I love to have a little sort of warm up to the god and sort of introduce them generally before we get into some more details. So Hestia, also Vesta in Roman tradition, Hestia actually means hearth. So it means flame, that thing that warms the house, that, you know, cooks the food and keeps one safe. So what's interesting about Hestia and about a lot of the gods that I typically will write about is that there aren't a lot of stories about her. And that always makes for a really interesting writing experience. And it can also make for a lot of interesting extrapolations that one might be able to make based on the Greek culture in those ancient times, remembering that it's not a monolith. And it can also make for some really wonderful, I think, modern interpretations and applications, because we can sort of sense from how she is treated, how she is seen in the little bits that we do see, we can get a sense of what her importance is and thus move that into the modern day. When I talk about the goddess of hearth, home, and community, I brought this forward as being her being an inspiration and a light in potentially dark times to guide us towards how do we work together in better ways, in more sustainable ways, in more effective ways. And I brought some practices along from my own organizational background, from my experience in reclaiming, from my experience with many groups, as sort of templates for how we could do this work of living and being in community better, more effectively. You insert the word that makes the most sense for you. So Hestia is the normal word for the hearth, the center of house and family. To banish or destroy a family is to drive out the hearth. The Polis community also has at its center a communal hearth, which stands in a temple or a prytantheon. And that's by William Burkert's work with Greek mythology. In this chapter, I go through some etymology, because who doesn't like to break up words to decide what they might mean and how we might be able to interpret them. And then go into a bit about Hestia as a virgin goddess. This is something that is not uncommon in Greek mythology. However, the modern definition of virgin and how it's actually applied with the Greek gods isn't always the same. So that's something to keep in mind. Hestia is, along with Artemis and Athena, those are the main virginal goddesses. However, that didn't necessarily mean no sex. It also can mean being sovereign. It can also mean, I don't want to get married. It could also mean, you can't tell me what to do. And Hestia, very specifically, was being pursued by a couple of other gods and went to Zeus, her father, and said, please don't. I don't want this. Please make sure that I never have to get married and that I never have to be, with anyone. And he granted that. But she's not the only one. And we can have long talks about why that is. And we will when my next book comes out later this year. So in that first chapter, I have a whole trance for connecting with Hestia. And for folks who have heard me say this a whole bunch of times, that I'm going to record the trances so that folks can do them on their own. I assure you that they are coming. Stay tuned for YouTube and potentially other places. And for me, trance working is such a delightful entryway, because you can have whatever experience you might have. You can introduce yourself to a god, you might reconnect with a god, you might have another experience altogether because you're in a certain place in your life, you have a certain question, you have a certain quandary. So trance working, in my experience, is open in a whole bunch of ways and is a great place to start. So chapter 2, we do go into the birth and the family of Hestia, and there's a huge story about that, mostly about how Zeus, was afraid that his children were going to take his power from him. Born of Kronos and Rhea, but, Zeus actually rescues Hestia, so let me backtrack that. But so Hestia is born of Kronos and Rhea, but Kronos, of course, it's such a common story in Greek mythology. Kronos hears from somebody that one of his children is going to overtake him and doesn't want that to happen, so swallows all the children, because that's what you do. And they have to get rescued. They were rescued by Zeus. And Hestia is an interesting part of this whole story because she is the one who is both first and last born because of having two births. Originally born, swallowed, then Zeus breaks them all out, and then is born again. So all of the siblings that Hestia has, just to keep score here, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, Hades. So think about all of them being swallowed up. So she does get elevated to be one of the Olympians. And one of the things that I absolutely love about Hestia and love about the fact that, I don't know, the reason why she's probably not talked about a lot, or at least in my impression / Robert Graves' storytelling, is that Hestia saw all of her siblings be absolutely messy and gossipy and kind of jerks. And she said, I don't want any of this. And sort of steps back and says, I don't want to be an Olympian anymore. And says, Dionysus, you can have it. Now, is that supported in all the text? Does it make sense for Hestia? To me, yes, it does make sense. But chapter 3, I go into a whole bunch of stories. Well, not a whole bunch, there aren't a lot. But I go through some stories and this about her because it's always great to have some context and to have some understanding of at least what people have already been saying, how texts have already been translated. So according to some of my research, gentle and peace-loving, Hestia doesn't appear in too many myths. Plato says that this is because she has to remain in the house of the gods, all alone, tending to the eternal celestial fire, when all the other Olympians ritually pass in processions through the heavens. This is both her privilege and her predicament. Consequently, Hestia's only manifestation among humans was the crackling of the fire. Aristotle says that it is the sound of the goddess laughing. This is something to say. I know I say it later in the book, but I'm going to say it here too. Hestia, we give the gods human forms, but Hestia could also just be flame. She doesn't necessarily have a form, and there's some talk about whether or not, is she just like a mythopoetic? Is she just the flame? Is she a being? I say choose your own adventure. And I also think that, especially if you're interested in building a relationship with Hestia, maybe you come and meet her in those different forms to see which one resonates with you and which one allows you to work with the energies that you want to work with her. Now, in the stories about Hestia, I go through, like I said, only a few. And one is her role in the War of the Titans, the whole story about her choosing to remain a virgin. There's another story by the poet Ovid about her and a donkey. I'm not even going to go into that. You get to enjoy that on your own. And those are the main ones. So again, I alluded to Robert Graves' version of Hestia not wanting to be part of the Olympians. So also look that one up. But it's interesting to note that she just really isn't mentioned. And if you've been around for any of my other work, you might have noticed that this could be something very similar to how I've talked about the Norns in the past. The Norns in Norse mythology are those beings or goddesses, you know, they have different translations, interpretations of time. So that which is in the past, the present, and the future, in its simplest description. They don't have a lot of stories either. And the way I have described that in the past, or at least my hypothesis, is that when something of a being or a god is kind of omnipresent, because they're involved in everything, time is everywhere all the time. If Hestia is the hearth, and she is the eternal flame, maybe also in Olympus, but also in political centers and also in people's homes, maybe you don't have specific stories because she's everywhere. In my opinion, I think that might be something to consider. So, as I talk about in a lot of my books too, working with the stories of a god is really helpful for beginning to build relationships with them or just to build a knowledge set, whether that is reading the stories, whether it is finding recordings of people reading the stories, whether it is finding different translations, finding various children's books with pictures and this like simplified versions of the stories. I think all of that is part of building the fire of who Hestia is for you and how she might show up for you. A lot of this book, though, however, focuses on how to work with her energies and how to work with that, especially when you're interested in building community, when you're interested in making sure that your community remains healthy or comes back to a healthy place. It is a super common experience, from what I can gather, that a lot of communities had times where they were reevaluating their values, their energy, their direction, their mission, etc., because of the pandemic. Because a lot of those communities were, had to sort of break apart, stay apart. And in those moments, without having necessarily a plan for that, it was harder to bring folks back together, and it still is to this day. And I don't think that that's necessarily any sort of criticism of a community. What I do think it is that it's a recognition that maybe some stronger structures may have been helpful to keep the cohesiveness and help people come back together a bit more easily, or to be able to adapt to new conditions. Because for me, at least, I've seen a lot of communities go online versus being in person. And that's a struggle for a lot of folks. And it also opened up accessibility and really focused on accessibility, which is a really good thing. So how do we sort of balance those two things? And probably more than that, but how do we meet the moment that we're in now? And how do we build community in this moment versus trying to recreate something from the past? And I will just say personally that I think that is the big question of, society in this moment is, I think many people are dreaming of a new world and dreaming of a new way of being in relationship, of being in community. But when you're dreaming up something new, it requires a creativity that goes beyond what you know. So how do you dream up something you've never seen before? How do you start to create something that is completely new by disregarding everything that's come before? And so I would imagine, or I can imagine, that maybe starting with lighting a fire that says you want to build community, and maybe lighting that fire by working with Hestia or another god, is a nice starting point to create safety in which that creativity can bloom and blossom and begin to reveal, hopefully, some answers to what might come next. So chapter 4 I've called Worshipping Hestia, which, if you know me, I don't typically say worshipping a lot, but here's why I used it for this. Oxford Languages defines worship as the feeling or expression of reverence and adoration for a deity, or the acts or rites that make up a formal expression of reverence for a deity, a religious ceremony or ceremonies. So Hestia, for not having a lot of stories and not seemingly having a big, place in Greek mythology, there are temples. She is often seen being worshipped alongside Apollo and Poseidon. And she's also mentioned at the Temple of Delphi. So she did have a place of importance. And again, one might continue to question, why wasn't she written about more if she was so important and was beside all these beings? I want to be clear in a lot of my writing that I know I write from a place of wanting to create accessibility with the gods, to the gods, and I tend to modernize practices because, in all fairness, we don't really know with a lot of confidence what was done in the past. We have a lot of hints of things we can extrapolate, but like I said before, ancient Greece is not a monolith. There wasn't just one way of practicing. There wasn't one way of thinking about the gods. A lot of it depended on where you were located, what the time and culture were calling for, and what resonated with the people of that moment. But what is true, as far as we can tell, with Hestia, is that Hestia was worshipped in the mundane, which for some folks might be read as boring. But when we think of the mundane, or at least when I think of the mundane is most of what life is. It's not really all the exciting things or the sexy things or the moments where your just heart is bursting or you're falling into a puddle on the ground. Most of life is the mundane, everyday, kind of boring, nothing to write home about sort of things. And Hestia was in that. So again, we see her in a whole bunch of moments, in most moments. While the idea of worship seems complicated and even dull, Hestia was worshipped in the mundane, but essential moments of life. She would witness the preparation of meals by families at the hearth, which was the religious focus of a home and the place of offerings and sacrifices. The thing to remember about the hearth that I go into here is the hearth is not just about cooking. It's not just about warming the home. It was also the place where you celebrated things, where you celebrated births, where you mourned people who died. And especially in that time, the hearth was essential to life. And because it was so essential to life, everyone was there all the time. It was a central focus. And that was something that was honored by keeping the hearth going, by making sure that the hearth never went out. And in some things that I read, if the hearth ever did go out, somebody would have to go to Delphi to go get fire from there or to some other sacred place to relight it. You couldn't just grab a match and relight it. It had to actually come from the sacred sites, which makes it a really important thing to not only manage and tend to, but also to be aware of. You would, I can imagine, always somewhere in your head have an awareness of the hearth and the central focus of family. So even if you didn't go to the temple, your temple was also at home. And we can also talk a lot about, in a lot of cultures, this idea that the women tended to tend to the hearth. So Edith Hamilton, who, this book, Mythology, which I reference because it's an oldie but goodie, she writes about that every meal began and ended with an offering to Hestia. Hestia in all dwellings of men and immortals, yours is the highest honor. The sweet wine offered first and last at the feast, poured out to you duly. Never without you can gods or mortals hold banquet. This is not just a place of sort of nostalgia. One might think like the home is this nostalgic place of connection and family, which it definitely is. But the fire is also about survival. And this is where community building comes in. as much as we can and do often rely on ourselves. You know, building community is also about survival. It's not just about good times. It's about the moments that are harder. It's about the moments of conflict. And it's about how do we come back from that? How do we grow stronger? Or how do we find new connections? And how do we find what works better for our values or the particular moment in time? In this chapter, I go through various traditions that Hestia was involved with. So birth, marriage, mourning, also public worship, and also traditional sacrifices. Lots of sacrificing in ancient Greece, such as it is. And of course, when you have sacrifice, you often have a fire. And so she was involved in a lot of that. I also wanted to bring in the modern worship ideas because I think that that is often more accessible. And also Hestia is full of modern interpretations, in my opinion. I mean, thinking about the modern ideas of cooking with Hestia, you know, the next great cooking show. But, you know, different ways to cook with her and how to bring that energy into meals, how to bring that energy into the making of meals. I know that for myself, working on this book and thinking about Hestia, it was definitely inspiring. And I noticed that at a couple points when I was writing this last year, I would try to cook a little bit more and I would try to remember Hestia and to acknowledge her before doing that. And now when I do any sort of Greek ritual or Greek, like sacred space that's sort of interpreted through the ancient Greek lens, I always start with an acknowledgement of Hestia, except for when I forget. But more often than not, I will include her. And sometimes folks used to leave an offering. I think that's always a lovely thing, or light a candle. Those are different ways to acknowledge her, amongst many others. I also put into this, and this might not be fun for some folks, but I think that some modern worship of Hestia can include cleaning. How do you tend to the home? How do you tend to community? How do you make space? How do you respect a space? I think that this is probably one of the places that really does come from my mentoring from Copper. Not that necessarily she was always cleaning, but there was something about the work that is unseen and often not valued because it's not glamorous, but it is necessary. It is something that helps promote respect and an honoring of a space or of a group. And so even these mundane tasks, Hestia of the mundane, are very important, and they help also give space for people to participate. And when people participate and they feel like they're, you know, adding something to a group or adding something to a space, that cultivates a sense of belonging and value. I have a place in this community. I have something I can do. And while I don't want to associate that too closely to the idea of you only have value if you do stuff, because I don't think that that's necessarily true, but there is a very human thing of wanting to feel like you belong. And I've seen this in communities that people, you know, come to rituals and then stay after and go, oh, how can I help? You feel like you're helping the community because you are. You know, all those rituals that I have helped facilitate, people who are taking all those chairs and bringing them out to the big circle space, even though it takes a lot of time and they're heavy and they're awkward, that was incredibly valuable work. And while I don't want to create a hierarchy of what work is more valuable than another, it's just as valuable as someone standing up in the middle of a ritual and saying pretty words. We also need to have seats for people. We also want to have maybe food to share. There are places for folks. We need help cleaning up afterwards because we've all shared this space and we want it to be ready for the next time we meet or for the next group. I could talk about unseen service and a lot because as an organizer, as a ritual planner, as someone who has, we used to call it the sacred schlepping of things, that is so important. And if you don't know how important it is, don't assign anybody those roles and then see, then you might change your mind. We need people to move the chairs and to make sure the bathrooms have toilet paper in them and to make sure there's not stuff on the floor that someone might trip on or too many branches on the field that we're trying to do a maypole dance in. And for me, especially with Hestia and a lot of other deities, this brings up my proposal that this is a modern form of sacrifice. You know, I think a lot of folks will wince at the idea of sacrifice because, especially in Western culture and maybe especially in the US, there is this idea that we shouldn't have to give anything up and we should be able to have all that we want and everything should be perfect all the time. And that's what we're aspiring to. But community building is not that simple or easy or glorious all the time. It is actually when we show up when we don't feel like it, when we show up when we're tired, when we show up because people need us, because this ritual needs support. And that is a sacrifice of sorts. It is a sacrifice of time, of attention, resources. And I have done that in the past because it's important, because it's what's needed. And to be perfectly honest, at some point, I'm going to need that support too. And so how can I create a relationship within a group or a ritual that demonstrates that I'm here for you, you're here for me? It might require us to stretch our resources a little bit, but it is really important. I've seen more talk lately about the dismantling of the idea that, oh, we don't owe anything to each other. We do. If we want to build a community, we do. We do owe each other time and what you can give, obviously, like not necessarily going beyond, but sometimes maybe it's important. You know, sacrifice, the word is, you know, to make sacred. And it is a sacred thing to say, like, I have this resource and I'm offering it in this space so that you can be supported, because that is how we make relationships. That's how we create sustainable relationships. So there's a whole section on that. I actually brought, I think, some of this up in my book on Iris too. This idea that service, yes, sustainability, but also sometimes it's gonna feel like you're stretching stuff. And I think that that is worthwhile. I mean, we talk a lot about, you know, mutual aid or, you know, community care, this idea that what I have might help you, and then maybe days or years down the road, what you have might help me. I don't do that service because I expect something in return, but I do it because I want to, because I know it's helpful, and because I know that that is something that keeps community going. And I think that was the trick with COVID and with pandemic and with anything that sort of pulls communities apart, is that there's this sort of not really a recognition that we have to keep giving in the ways that we can in order to keep things moving and growing. We can't just sit around and kind of go like, well, I hope someone's going to do that. And because you might be the person, if you're looking around going, who's going to do that? Ah, that's me. Maybe. And there's also a section here, you know, this modern worship of Hestia, about community tending and volunteering, which goes along with some of the things that we talked about. I also include in here a blessing for the home, so that if you would like to bless the home or maybe some other space where people gather, might be lovely. It's calling on Hestia. I also put in some modern sacrifices. You know, the unseen labor is certainly one of them, or like the unglorified labor, but also modern sacrifices of, you know, local herbs or food donations or, you know, giving your time and energy. One of the things that I think is, I mean, it's already sort of discussed, but I really associate Hestia with hearth magic. And for me, that means a whole bunch of different things. A lot of people have written about this already, so I don't spend a ton of time there. But for me, it is the magic of bringing people together in a shared space or a shared hearth, a shared fire. And maybe not literally, but also maybe I bring in the story of a friend who used to have these annual parties to make tamales, and everybody would get together right before the end of the year, and people would all like help out in making them, and when they were all made and cooked and everything, everybody got to take some home. No money was exchanged, but just time and effort, and you got to laugh with people, and you got to screw up, and you also got tamales at the end, which is pretty lovely, and I highly recommend that kind of coming together. And so that was chapter 4. Chapter 5 is about Hestia and the Hearth. So there's a lot written about the Hearth, so I wanted to really bring that in, and the importance of that. The idea that there are, hearths in a whole bunch of different spaces in ancient Greece and in just cultures. I don't want to just limit that to Greece. And I brought it through some of the history, and then also talking about how to build a modern hearth and how to create that in your space. But not only physically, but also how do you build a hearth within your heart? Now, early in writing this book, I think I had a typo in the title. So it used to say Hestia, goddess of heart, home and community, and no one noticed it because it made sense. And then I did, and I was like, oh no. But I think that's true. Like, how do we build like this flame in our hearts? That flame that helps us keep going in those times that it's really hard, or a flame that allows us to remember what's important and how to, continue to focus or bring my focus back to that. And I bring in the ideas of, trying to figure out what values are in a group, how to figure out like when those are shifting, how to choose them, how to work with that as a group, because when we have shared ideas about where we're going next, we're all invested and we're all, sort of bought in, and that makes it easier. When you have groups that have a lot of disparate values, that's when you often get like conflict and some crunchy moments. And it's not about, everybody having like the same ideas of what to do. It's more about when we all have the same values. We might not all express those in the same way, but we can see that we're all aiming towards the same thing. And that, I think, creates more energy in a group, because you're not questioning like maybe not consciously, but you're not questioning like, why is that person here? You know why everybody's there. You know why you're there. On those days where you're really tired, you're like, why I don't want to be there. And you're like, you know what? Community building is important. Getting people together for magic or community care, etc. It's important. And if I'm committed to community building, how am I supporting that today? Chapter 6 is symbols and offerings for those folks who like to have, more specific correspondences or how to interact with a god. And I would encourage folks to look at this as a beginning conversation versus like the end, these are the only things you can do. There are plenty of things I'm sure folks can come up with Hestia. Obviously the fire is in here. But also there's the kettle, the chase tree, and also I put in some ideas of other things that you might offer to her. But when you think about somebody who is into community and into maybe low drama, what do you bring to them? You might bring things that show your commitment to community. You might bring, your group's mission statement. You might surround a picture of those that you love and your family with candles. You might bring a bite of food. Chapter 7 is a bit more practical. Not that any of the rest of it isn't, but it's called Building Communities for Hestia. Now, we could probably say with Hestia, so you do you. But I think that one of the things that is missing in conversations is this idea of how do we actually do this? Like, we know that sustainable communities are a thing, and it sounds great, and we hear stories of how that works, but how do we do it? I think some books will go into like why it's important. Yes, we know, but how? So I move readers through sort of how do you define your community? How do you define your value? How do you figure out what your shared vision is? And because I think that's the way to begin, especially, I might say especially if you already have a group and you're sort of feeling like you're not on the same page. Like, how can you have like a good number of folks from that group come together and maybe ask everybody like what's important to you? Maybe it's all different now. Over the years, things do change and things do shift. And knowing that helps you sort of navigate whether maybe the group needs to look different. Maybe some folks don't feel like they belong to this one in this moment, which is fine. It does happen. But better to find that out than to constantly be arguing over what your shared vision should be, in my opinion. So it goes through that. I actually really talk through all the steps so that folks can see how to do this, how to really enact this with a group. And this is based on my own experience with building groups and also, working with groups through conflict and through burnout, because that happens a lot. So, defining community and value, creating your purpose and your mission. Again, very much step by step. I get kind of granular here so that folks are feeling like they know exactly what to do in a short book. And that also includes a description of, in Reclaiming Witchcraft that I'm a part of, we use consensus for decision making. And so I go through how to use that well, so that folks can, have a process in place of how to interact with each other when you're making decisions. And it's also just a really great way to create a conversation that is not hierarchical. It is not necessarily one voice. It's allowing space for all voices to be a part of the conversation, everybody to have input about their ideas, and then to figure out what works best for the group. And thus the group comes to decisions that they can all, stand behind. Even if you're not all getting exactly what you want every time, when you're having these conversations and you're working through what people think about things, what they might, they're like, oh, I might want that to look different than what you're saying. All of that is really helpful. And it is, again, you come to decisions that people are really behind. And I also think that that is helpful because even if your specific ideas don't get into this particular decision, you see that ideas are held well. And so maybe the next time your idea might be the one that comes through. I could break that down forever, but I think that that is a helpful practice. You might not use it, but I do talk about it. And then talking about how to build a hearth. So I was once a part of a spiritual tradition practice, not real sure what to call it, where the groups were called hearths. And so that some of these tips come out of what I observed from that and how I think it would be wise to set up groups like that in the future. And again, some of it feels repetitive, but I think it's really wise to remember, no, we have to start with agreements. We have to, creating systems and practices before you're in the midst of conflict or, having a bunch of new people come in is just really helpful. Always front load your processes and you can always adjust them later. But instead of trying to figure out how to solve a problem when you're in the midst of a problem, it is always better to have that practice ready to go. Because when your brain is ticked off or activated, or you're in the middle of whatever crisis is going on in the world, not the time to figure out, not always the best time for problem solving. So having practices around conflict, around how we make decisions, how are we getting together? What do we do? Super helpful. And I want to impress too that this sounds like kind of boring. I mean, Hestia is of the mundane, but also I put very specifically in here that part of community building is to have fun together. It is not just about meetings. It is not just about how do we fix this and that. Copper was so good at this. You know, all of our meetings would be potlucks. We would just have time where we just hung out, and you would get to know people. You would get to understand what's important to them, what they were worried about in the moment, what their kids were up to, you know, how work was treating them. And people, you know, became more than just, you know, who's in this group and what are we doing. People, you got to know people, you built relationships with them. And when you build relationships, you're going to interact with people a bit more effectively because you are invested to some degree in their happiness and their well-being. So have fun. Not everything is about work. That's what capitalism says, but it's actually not. I also talk about community care. This has come up a lot. I have seen this actually recently in a social media post. Somebody was talking about this, that often, and I've seen this idea that, you know, we often say self-care, 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 when we really mean community care. Like self-care sort of thrusts it back on people, and I could go into a whole thing about how that was sort of co-opted from Audre Lorde's, ideas. But community care is something that will help the community support itself, and people don't have to do stuff alone because humans aren't really designed to do that. You know, we're meant to sort of be together in larger groups, things like that. It's only with the advent of, you know, capitalism and various cultural shifts that we're all in separate homes and all with our individual things and nobody shares stuff. And so I invite the possibility that community care is something that can also be prioritized so that we're not burning ourselves out really quickly. We can sometimes go, I just need help, because sometimes we do. And I see that so often arrive in moments where people are sick, where people are dying, and those are moments definitely to do that. But there's also more of the mundane, everyday, my job sucks, I got laid off, you know, or my marriage crumbled, etc. Those are also moments where community care is helpful. Or community care could just be like, I'm exhausted, or I have, you know, an autoimmune condition that's flaring. Community care, having that in place and having that be a shared value is so helpful, and so I think in alignment with Hestia. And I put in here too some rituals that you can do as a community, as a group, so that you have ways to navigate transitions, like rites of passage, things like that. And I also think that the more shared practice that you have together, the more you're able to, you know, have shared experiences and become more vulnerable with each other and begin to tap into sort of like the consciousness of the group as a whole versus just the individual. And then chapter 8, which is the last chapter, is cultivating a modern relationship with Hestia. And I think that if you've read any of my other books, probably is not going to be too surprising what's in here. But also, I think that Hestia is someone for whom we don't have a lot of stories. We can't say, oh, let me just look at this story and how she handled such and such. We have the birth story, one might say stories, from being born once and then again. We have the story of her virginity, her and the donkey, her in the War of the Trojans. So there is a certain degree to which working with Hestia requires some intuitive practice and really more paying attention to her energy than to focus on, you know, well, it's like this myth. So that's something that I really go into detail in this book. Like, how do you cultivate an intuitive knowing of a God? How do you focus your attention? How do you create space? How do you do research? How do you reflect? Also, I talk more in this book, I think, more than some other books about expectations and agreements. When community building, that's part of it too. Like, what do I want from this group? What do I expect? And are we all on the same page? Because if we're not, that's going to make stuff a little tricky and probably more challenging than it needs to be. So coming up right from the start, what do you expect from your relationship with Hestia? What are the agreements that make sense? Because being really clear about that will allow you to know if this is the right relationship. And if you have the time, if you have the resources to keep that going. I can't necessarily walk into building a relationship with Hestia and say, oh, I'm going to dedicate 2 hours and build you a hearth the size of a building, and I don't follow through on that. It has to be realistic. And I would also say that I don't really want to go to gods and go like, I expect you to heal everything that's been going on with me ever in my life. Not sure that's realistic, but I mean, go for it. If it works out, tell me who to go with. But like, just really getting clear, like, here's what I expect. Here's what I can give. And then see what happens. And that will, just like any relationship, it'll probably have to change because lives change, priorities change, relationships change. They just do. Thinking about ways to do some daily practices, sort of enter Hestia into the mundane, I think is just going to be the messaging of this. When we make these practices very everyday, they become just something that we do versus like, oh, I have to remember my devotional practice. I have to remember, Hestia doesn't strike me as it being like that. I don't think, no drama, or at least as little drama as possible. Like, Hestia is really great for like having very, practices at every meal or at certain family events. She can be really easily integrated into a life from what I've experienced so far. Also, how do you, I talk a bit about rituals that you can do for the hearth. So to sort of keep that going, if not lit, then to be energized and to be a focus. Also, I think Hestia is really a good deity to work with when you're wanting to cultivate or strengthen a practice in gratitude. So I talk about that. And I also talk about, because I think this is important for the community building aspect, how to work with other gods alongside a god. I don't know if I think this might be one of the first books where I start talking about that, because that's such a common question. And I thought, well, if we're talking about community and building, maybe we talk about communities of gods. How do we do that? How do you navigate everybody's needs? How do you make space for everybody? How do you be a human and want to maybe have many gods around you? There's also a section in here about troubleshooting relationships with deities, because that is a very, very common question. And I also have a ritual to dedicate to Hestia if you are interested in doing something like that for yourself or for a group. All of the things in here can be adjusted based on what you need. Hestia is the beginning and the end, the one who is born and reborn. She is the source of life and sustenance, and the one to watch over the family in all of its stages. If there is any god that knows family, it's Hestia. She stands to the side, becoming the important and eternal flame to keep the peace and to honor communities. Hestia might seem simple, might seem straightforward, and to a certain extent, yeah, because community is where we thrive. Coming together with people is how we can get support and give support. So while there's a lot of emphasis in this book about like how she can bring people together, and also she's kind of mundane and doesn't really have a lot told about her, that's kind of what community is sort of meant to be. It's meant to be this thing that you can count on because it's there, because it's always been there. The fact that we're trying to come back to it is a new concept. And so it feels like it's some weird, strange practice. But it really isn't. It is what we do naturally. When you stand in a group with people, eventually your heartbeats and your movements sort of become more in alignment. We feel safer when we're with more people, more often. Now, the right people. But our bodies are designed to seek out another. Now, whether that's a human or a god is really up to you. But I might say that Hestia has never left. She's always been around. And she is the one to turn to when you just need to be reminded that you're not alone in this, or you don't have to be. So my hope for this book is that folks can use it in their communities, use it in their family, use it within themselves. You know, the community and the support they give to yourself is also pretty important. And maybe to think about the ways in which community can look. Like, what would happen if it could look the way you imagine? What if it could look the way that you need it to be? And again, like I said in the beginning, I think that there's an upswelling of this desire to have something different from what we've seen in the past. And that's going to require us to get really creative and to think beyond what we know and what we expect and what we've heard is the right thing to do. And I think Hestia can be the inspiration for that because she's still around. And her practices can shift and change, and so can ours. If comments come through in the next few minutes, I'm happy to answer questions or address anything that might be lingering. But that's sort of the summary. And thanks so much for joining this quickie book launch. And I appreciate the community that you are building wherever you are, or the ones that you hope can either begin or come back together again. These times we really need community more than ever. And may it be healthy and strong and wise. And if there aren't any things, you can get this book at all the booksellers that you think of. And yeah, the chase tree. Let me just switch back to that. So that is a plant that Hestia is seen with in various images. And it's a shrub that's found in the Mediterranean. It has violet or blue or white flowers and berries. So what's interesting about the chase tree and why it is called that is that it's the opposite of an aphrodisiac. So it's supposed to like quell feelings of attraction to another. So it reduces those. And if we think about Hestia and being virginal or virgin, that seems to be in alignment. Thanks, Jane. I appreciate it. Yeah, you can get my book at all the booksellers that you might usually, or if you're not supporting certain booksellers, I do have it on my website, but also Bookshop is a great place, in the US at least. And I have a storefront through them too. But you can also always reach out to me. I can help you find a copy. Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope I bestow many blessings on your communities, such as they are and such as they are going to become. I look forward to seeing what arises from these moments. Unfortunately, these moments often instigate what we need or what we need to know. So that, and I think that's hopeful, honestly. If we can cling to something, I'll cling to that. All right. Thanks so much, folks, and thanks for being here, and I appreciate you. And if you're watching this later, thanks so much for your time. This is going to go up on YouTube eventually, and it'll stay up on Facebook as long as they let it stay up. I have no idea. All right. Got it last week. Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Much love to England for you. I will see you the next time.